to History Class with Dr. W. In our previous lecture, we started talking about the period between the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, a period in which I described the citizens in the colonies maintaining their allegiance to Britain early on, but by the end of which they're going to be prepared to launch a revolution against the most powerful empire in the world. And so in this lecture, we continue that discussion of the series of acts of the British Empire against the colonies that eventually are going to drive them into war. We concluded the previous lecture by talking about the Stamp Act and the various acts of opposition to it in the colonies. At the end of that discussion, I mentioned that the Stamp Act itself was repealed, but in the same breath, the British Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, insisting that Parliament had the right to legislate for the colonies in all manners whatsoever. So the Declaratory Act is a kind of act of defiance by the British government against what was this sort of budding opposition in the colonies. And so one of the first things that comes after the Declaratory Act are a series of acts passed by the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain named Charles Townshend. Now, Townshend was determined to demonstrate that the Declaratory Act had teeth, and so he implemented this series of taxes known as the Townshend Acts. These acts heavily taxed items imported to the colonies such as glass, paper, lead, tea, wine, and others. These acts induced much resentment from the colonists, in part because the purpose of the money raised from those taxes was to pay the soldiers I described in the previous lecture who were being housed in the colonies. Things got even worse when the officials who were sent to collect these taxes proved to be a greedy and rapacious lot, enforcing the laws without mercy, and colonial displeasure grew as this pressure mounted. In 1769 in Virginia, George Washington read the Virginia Resolutions, stating that only Virginians can tax Virginians. They adopted a non-importation agreement at that point and eventually were pushing ourselves closer and closer to overt war between the colonies and Britain. Up and down the colonies, tension was mounting between the colonies and Britain. In 1770 in Boston, I talked previously about the tensions between the soldiers who were being housed in the colonies and the colonists themselves. And in Boston, this tension was really rising to a fever pitch. There were a number of minor kind of skirmishes between the soldiers and the townspeople of Boston. But in 1770, this broke out into overt violence in the incident that is known as the Boston Massacre. Now, you may have heard some details about this story. The episode was initiated by a group of Bostonians harassing a group of British soldiers, pelting them with snowballs on this cold and snowy day. But in this case, the soldiers actually opened fire on the crowd, and 5 Bostonians were left dead. Now, obviously, this kind of violence escalated the disenchantment that was growing in the colonies. And in the aftermath of this, Samuel Adams in Boston headed up the Committee of Correspondence, which I mentioned briefly last time. The Committee of Correspondence voiced grievances among the colonies and helped to bring the colonies together in opposition to Britain. So you're going to have representatives in Virginia, representatives in Boston, and all up and down the colonies who are contributing to this Committee of Correspondence. And so we're starting to see the colonies speaking with one voice against Britain. As the tension in the colonies continued to mount, Boston was the scene of another of the signature episodes in this build-up to the Revolution, the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Now, this came in reaction to another of these acts that were passed by the English Parliament to tax the colonies. In this case, it was the Tea Act. And I need to give you a little bit of background to this because it's not so clear why the colonists responded in the way they did. The first thing I would note is that the English Constitution and all of the laws kind of following out of it are not always written down. It's based on precedent. And so when England passed the Tea Act against the colonies, one of the important things at issue was that if the colonists simply submitted to this, it would establish the precedent that English Parliament had the right and ability to pass this kind of tax, and the colonies would just accept it. Now, the Tea Act itself actually lowered the price of British tea. It was a mechanism that kind of brought into an official format the tea trade. There was a lot of smuggling and a lot of purchase of tea from other sources. And so this act, while it would have formalized the relationship between British tea importers and the colonists, more importantly, it would have established the precedent that Britain could pass these kind of acts. So, while the price would have gone down, the precedent would have been put in place. And so we begin to see a serious reaction against the Tea Act, which again is reflected up and down the colonies, even though we associate this most visibly with Boston. So, the Sons of Liberty began to organize a protest against it. In the infamous Boston Tea Party, they dressed up as Indians, raided an English tea ship, and dumped some 90,000 pounds of tea into the ocean. Parliament responded by ratcheting up the pressure yet again in an act known as the Coercive Acts or the Intolerable Acts, which did a number of things, among them closing the port of Boston. It also removed certain trials from the colonies to a jury of one's peers back to England. And finally, another act, the Quebec Act, expanded the boundaries of the province of Quebec into the Northwest Territories, area at that time that was claimed by New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And so with the Coercive Acts, things were really beginning to reach ahead. In response to the Intolerable Acts, colonial leaders called for the First Continental Congress, which was held in September of 1774. There, the colonists asserted that Parliament had no authority in the colonies. Now, at that point, they continued to declare their loyalty to England, but to the Crown in England, not to Parliament. The response from Parliament was more restrictive measures and more troops sent to the colonies, at which point conflict with the colonies was beginning to look inevitable. Eventually, the colonists start arming themselves and preparing for conflict, and ultimately the forces clashed in the initial battles of the Revolutionary War at Lexington and Concord, which I'll talk about in the next lecture. In 1775, colonists organized the Second Continental Congress, at which point they are officially organizing for war and also making some initial efforts at establishing a new nation. Out of the Second Continental Congress, a final attempt to reconcile with the king and with England was rejected, and in the aftermath, the British sent a huge army to the colonies, and the colonies themselves began preparing and bracing for war, including establishing a continental army and naming George Washington as its commander-in-chief. Now, throughout this period, one of the most important voices in support of this growing rebellion was the Virginian Patrick Henry, who made a number of famous speeches during this time. He was selected to serve as a delegate at the First Continental Congress in 1774, where he helped, along with Samuel Adams and others, to stoke the fires for revolution. During the proceedings at the First Continental Congress, Henry said at one point, "The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American." It was the following year that Patrick Henry made his most famous speech at the Virginia Convention in March of 1775, which you see in the dramatic picture here. At that convention, Patrick Henry sounded the call to arms, saying, "Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death.